Welcome back, everybody, and we're back with a bit of a bang. It's CNN talking about child poverty in the UK, and a large number of MPs either denying it or saying really disgusting comments and making insinuations about poverty within the UK and the people who are suffering from that poverty. In front of you is a delightful tweet from Ben Bradley, he's an MP for the Conservative Party. And he seems to be insinuating that the money is going to go towards or with people working in brothels, as he describes it, or it's going to be used on crack dens. I mean, personally, it just seems like a typical Conservative night out. You know, this is what they seem to spend their money on. They've all openly admitted to taking huge amounts of drugs, so, you know, it's okay for them, but again, not for everyone else. Just have a listen to what CNN, an American news station, says, and then we're going to have a little bit of a look at what Rees-Mogg says, some of the other stuff he said in the past. We're going to look at also Dominic Raab and some of the horrible things that he said, and you're just going to start to see a bit of a pattern. We're even going to have a quick look at Dominic Cummings. The main thing to take away from all of this and to think about is elitism the ideology of the Conservative Party? Is elitism causing the problems within the country in relation to poverty? So sit back and just have a listen to some of these Conservative MPs and just have a think, is this ideology actually spurring on the problems?
A campaign to feed children in the UK for the first time. The humanitarian organization says the pandemic has turned the lives of vulnerable children and families upside down, and they need help. Joining me now from London is CNN's Salma Abdelaziz. Salma, a historic move here, but not one without controversy. Take us through this.
That's absolutely right, Kim. And before we get into UNICEF's plans, I just want to lay the groundwork of this debate, because it might surprise some to hear that providing free school meals to children during holiday breaks is actually a matter of great controversy in this country. Over the last few months, there's been a very bitter debate that's been raging over this issue. On the one hand, you have the Prime Minister and the Conservative Party arguing that providing assistance to the country's neediest families during these school breaks, providing these meals, only increases their dependence on government aid and government support. On the other hand, you had football star Marcus Rashford, a beloved figure in this country, someone who had struggled with food poverty as a child himself, passionately arguing for school meals to be provided. He's twice forced the government into a U-turn on this issue, but just again to give you an idea of how divisive this is, at one point a few months ago, a Conservative politician linked providing school meals to children, to needy children, to crack dens in brothels. He later...
From the reaction to one of your posts on Twitter, when you alluded to, and I will quote the reaction that you've made to a reply to one of your quotes. A reply said that £20 cash direct to a crack den and brothel really sounds like the way forward with this one. After there was a tweet which said that one child lives in a crack den, another in a brothel, this was you, these are the kids that most need our help. You replied to this reply saying that's what free school meal vouchers in the summer effectively did. Would you like to explain what you meant by that?
Oh look, it's been totally taken out of context. I was merely making the point that there are kids who live in really chaotic situations, really difficult lives.
That's
we're actually giving them an unrestricted voucher to spend on whatever isn't helpful. What the point I'm making is we need to wrap our arms as a society around those families. That's why government's given that money to local government, because they are best placed working with social services, working with schools, to be able to find those families, to target them, to help them in a more kind of holistic way than meal vouchers.
Really don't have a clue about poverty within the UK. Okay, back to the CNN report.
In brothels. He later apologized for those remarks, but again, just showing you the firestorm criticism around this. Enter UNICEF yesterday with this announcement.
And we're going to hear Jacob Rees-Mogg.
In their 70-year history, they will be providing assistance to the neediest families in the UK. The organisation says a domestic emergency has been created by the coronavirus pandemic, and these families need help. But a senior government official said UNICEF should be ashamed of itself for these plans, calling them a political act of the lowest order.
The man hasn't got a Scooby-Doo. I've worked with a number of youth organisations in the past.
I think it's a real scandal that UNICEF
it does exist in
should
the
be playing politics
it's
in
not
this way,
something
when it is meant to be looking after
and frankly,
people in the poorest and most deprived countries in the world, where people are starving, where there are famines and where there are civil wars, and they make cheap political points of this kind, giving, I think, £25,000 to one council. It is a political stunt of the lowest order.
Great, 100,000, fantastic, but there's millions. We're estimating about 4 million in the UK at the moment, based on different statistics from different bodies, such as the United Nations and UNICEF.
To 2018-19, there are 100,000 fewer children in absolute poverty in this country. This is a record of successive conservatism, and UNICEF should be ashamed of itself.
There is
well,
a really
I would say we're not a political organisation, we're a child rights organisation. And we've been working in the UK for many years. We reach over 2 million children each year. And right now, in response to this global pandemic, which is probably the single biggest crisis we've faced as a country since World War II, we wanted to take this opportunity to step up and support children and families that are most in need.
So what I'm going to play for you now is another clip from Jacob Rees-Mogg talking about the Grenfell Tower tragedy, where 72 people died and 74 were hospitalised. This links in because Jacob Rees-Mogg gives off this impression that it only was a matter of using your common sense to get out of the Grenfell Tower, and that's why a large number of people perished. And then it goes on to say if it had been you or me, we would have used our common sense and would have left. Just have a listen. But also bear in mind, as you listen, and just bear in mind his referencing to elitism indirectly by suggesting that him and Nick Ferrari would have used their common sense. This caused absolute outrage, and Rees-Mogg disappeared for a while.
There have been suggestions that in part the tragedy was caused by either racism or policies of class. Are these suggestions correct?
I don't think so. I think the tragedy came about because of the cladding leading to the fire racing up the building, and then was compounded by the stay put policy. And it seems to me that is the tragedy of it, that the more one's read over the weekend about the report and about the chances of people surviving, if you just ignore what you're told and leave, you are so much safer. And I think if either of us were in a fire, whatever the fire brigade said, we would leave the burning building. It just seems the common sense thing to do. And it is such a tragedy that didn't happen, but I don't think it's anything to do with race or class.
I won't do as I'm told or instructed by anyone. I will do what I judge and deem to be the correct thing to do. And there's a really interesting thing coming up next, where just have a look at what Dominic Cummings does and have a little bit of a think about what Jacob Rees-Mogg says, and I've even inserted a few clips.
So let's remind you of what we heard from Dominic Cummings, who told the media yesterday that 4 days after the Prime Minister told the British public they must stay at home, his wife became unwell, possibly with COVID-19 symptoms. He went home to visit her, then returned to work.
It just seems the common sense thing to do.
You may remember that the guidance at the time was if you think your partner has coronavirus, you must stay at home and isolate as a household for 14 days. That evening, Mr. Cummings says they got into a car and drove 400 kilometres to Durham to his parents' home to isolate there.
If you just ignore what you're told and leave, you are...
During that time, they took their son to hospital in Durham, fearing he had the virus. This happened at a time when London was a hotspot for the outbreak. Durham was not.
If you just ignore what you're told and leave...
Then towards the end of their 14-day isolation, Mr. Cummings drove to Barnard Castle, 48 kilometres from his parents' home, with his wife and child. He says that that 97-kilometre round trip with his family was to test that his driving was fine before heading back to London, because he was having problems with his vision.
It just seems the common sense thing to do.
Starting to notice a pattern? Don't do what we say. Do what you think is correct. That's how it should be. And of course, we're also starting to see other issues pop up as a result of this, including all the issues surrounding COVID-19, which is a thing that's exacerbating all this poverty at the moment. Let's go back to the CNN report.
Family, and I can tell you that these kinds of debates, this controversy, this backlash against a charity providing food for hungry children, it's only going to make it worse, Kim.
Yeah, it's hard to fathom, I must say.
So to finish off my piece on elitism in the Conservative Party causing poverty and destruction of the UK, I've tried to find some evidence from primary source information. And I've got a Channel 4 report with some interviews, and I've got an interview with a UN inspector who came over to the UK to inspect the levels of poverty that were taking place. Just have a listen.
New figures from the Office for National Statistics show that almost 1 in every 3 households in Glasgow have no one in work, with a similar situation in Liverpool and the valleys of central Wales. And while jobs are being created, according to one think tank, a fifth of British workers earn less than the living wage, a figure arguably necessary for a basic standard of living. And this pressure on household budgets may be having an effect on Britain's children. Almost 80% of school support staff surveyed by the union Unison said they believe pupils were arriving in class hungry. Our social affairs editor Jackie Long has been given exclusive access to the video diaries of 2,500 children, and as she reports, 1 in 10 of them are consuming only half the calories of their classmates.
So that's 2013. We're going to skip forward to 2018 in a second. But this poverty is real. It is really taking place. And the government just don't want to know. And I get the impression that they think that the public are work shy, which is this old Victorian attitude that the reason you're poor is because you don't work hard enough. No, it's a fault within capitalism. It's a huge flaw within it. And in many ways, it can resolve it. And we're going to hear from the UN inspector who will talk about that very issue, and that there is a solution to this.
Governments can do better. People shouldn't be treated that way. I think that's how I feel, that there's a lot of people out there living in destitution in circumstances which is quite unnecessary. It could be obviated very easily.
There are many people who argue there is no real poverty in the UK, and really you shouldn't be here.
They should have been with me over the last couple of weeks. There are the figures. The think tanks are not doing this in order to keep themselves in employment. Thousands of food banks haven't sprung up because people are looking for things to do. There's very real poverty out there.
Let's have a listen to Dominic Raab. Let's see him do a karate and just completely put his foot in his mouth. It's been debunked what he says in this next clip. This is in 2017. It's in the build-up to the general election. And frankly, he just hasn't got Scooby-Doo.
The food bank issue, and I've studied the Trussell Trust data, what they tend to find is the typical user of food bank is not someone that's languishing in poverty, it's someone who has a cash flow problem episodically. No, it's true. But that is what the Trussell Trust data says. And it is. Sorry, no. Sorry, can I finish the point? No, they wouldn't.
So he's actually misquoted the report, and it's not what it says, and actually it's down to a systemic problem of poverty within the UK that's not being addressed by the UK government and the Conservative Party. And again, he doesn't think there's a problem. He's got his head in the sand. He doesn't want to know, and it's almost giving off an impression that he just doesn't want to go and mingle with people who do live in poverty, and has probably never looked at that as an actual issue. So it's interesting, because we're going to hear what the UN inspector says, and I wonder who he's talking about when he's saying what he says.
You met with government. What was their response?
They were pretty much unconcerned. They think that their policies are working. They focus really only on employment. They're delighted that they've got full employment, which is
that's right, isn't it?
A great
That's a good thing for
achievement. It's excellent. And it is a way out of poverty. There's no doubt about that. But the point is that the 1.5 million people who are in destitution are not being covered by the work hours that they're getting. So there's a lot of in-work poverty, as it's described. People who are working for such low money or unable to get enough hours, or even if they're full-time, they're not able to keep their family. I think government people haven't been out into the field, haven't had to talk to them, haven't explored what the real circumstances are. So I've had a number of people say to me, but we're not aware of this, we don't think there is poverty in our country. To which I would simply say, open your eyes, get out and take a look.
I think it's a real scandal that UNICEF should be playing politics in this way, when it is meant to be looking after people in the poorest, the most deprived countries in the world, where people are starving, where there are famines and where there are civil wars, and they make cheap political points of this kind, giving, I think, £25,000 to one council.
So what do you think? Do you think it is Tory elitism that's helping to cause and expand poverty within the UK? Do they have this ideology? Is this ideology just rampant throughout, that the poor are there because that's where they deserve to be? Have they got their head stuck in the sand and they're actually thinking, no, poverty doesn't exist in this country, even though all evidence is pointing to the fact that there are huge systemic issues in this country right now and no one's dealing with it? So, what are your thoughts? Put them in the comments below. Any questions, comments, put them in. Let's get interacting. Let's get a conversation going on this. In the meantime, I'm Political X. Thanks again for listening. See you next time. Bye for now.